Okay. All right, so we've been looking at foreign policy and basically this what types of decisions the presidents have made in the past regarding foreign policy in Latin American countries. So I guess kind of to tie that in, we were curious as to what kind of the decision process looks like in the White House when discussing or engaging in foreign policy.
So since I'd say World War II, the decision-making process for foreign policy decisions in the White House has run through a group called the National Security Council. The National Security Council, the way you should think about it is like they're kind of a coordinating body that tries to help help the president making decisions. They help with any decision that has to do with foreign policy. If it's something like the Iraq War, that's the group that helps to coordinate the decision-making process for the president. If it's a decision like, what do we do about sanctions in Venezuela? That's the group that helps make that decision. Or if it's even a decision like, who do we send to this international event if we need a high-level White House official? That's the group that makes that decision. For when President Obama was president of the United States, I served as the Deputy National Security Council director. So I was one of 4 people who helped to run the National Security Council on a regular basis. My focus was on economic issues. So for example, if the president was making a decision that had to do in some way with foreign policy that touched on the economy, I would be involved in it. For example, we're going to give aid to some country in terms of providing them with food. That would be the type of decision that I would work on for the president. And my goal would be to get together with other government officials to put together options for the president where the president could make a decision in terms of how much, what kind, and when would we provide that aid to the country.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
There's a few students, because we asked for like some student feedback and like questions that they had, and a few of them asked questions more along the lines of like, what is your everyday experience or like the everyday routine for someone in a foreign policy position at the White House? Like what does Tuesday morning look like, kind of thing?
Yeah, and it's a strange job because one of the things that you worry about when you work in a foreign policy job in the White House is espionage. And what we mean by espionage is that other countries want to know what the president of the United States is thinking about doing. So they're consistently trying to find out what his advisors are doing. So my office in the White House was something we call a secure facility. So in order to get into my office, I had to remove my cell phone, my Apple Watch, anything that could transmit, and I had to put it in a box. And then my office had 3 combinations I had to enter to just get into my office. And within the office, there was nothing electronic that someone could pick up on. So my day always started with me going into this room where like I had little ability to contact the outside world other than through my desk phone. And the way my day would start, so every day the president of the United States usually will start his day with a briefing on all the foreign policy challenges that are happening in the world. So everything from potential terrorist attacks to economic challenges. Right now, it's going to be a lot on how COVID-19 is impacting the rest of the world. But before the president gets that briefing, what will happen is that officials like me would have gotten the briefing ahead of time. So the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, has a number of people who work there overnight to put together this briefing. And a briefer would show up at my office each day at around 7:30 in the morning and would give me a briefing on the information that would go to the president, but also a bunch of information that I needed to know to do my job. And we'd go through it together, and I'd highlight things and flag things and think about what we needed to tell the president based on that information. So my day would often start with a meeting with the CIA official who was sent to brief me. And then I would do meetings with, in the White House Situation Room, with the other deputies usually. So we had deputies who covered everything from economics, like I did, to someone who covered counterterrorism and also Homeland Security. That would be the person today who would be in charge of dealing with COVID-19. And then a principal deputy who was in charge of making sure that we all stayed organized. And our job, every day we'd get together, actually I think it was on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we get together to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we're doing and how we're coordinating the decision-making process on national security issues. So a great deal of my mornings were spent in these meetings where I was both trying to understand what happened in the world the night before, and then trying to coordinate what our response would be, but also push forward on a bunch of policy decisions. And then like most jobs, I would spend a great deal of time reading paper, providing edits, and writing memos. And then oftentimes, because my job was global, I'd spend a lot of time on the phone with foreign officials. Because China is on the other side of the world and they're so important, I'd often be doing calls late at night or really early in the morning with my Chinese counterparts to talk about issues and make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the things that we're working on. So that would be a typical day for me. It would usually start. I'd get into the office before 7. I'd probably leave around 8 or 9.
Wow, long day.
Yeah, the problem when your office, when you're not allowed to I couldn't do work from home because my office I worked on things that were secure. So it meant that I had to be in this office that was really a safe to do most of my job. So I couldn't go home and look it up on my iPhone or do it on my laptop at home. So if I was going to be working, I had to be in the office to do my job.
Wow.
There is a kind of like a two-part, you described like a logistical difficulty if you're like in your almost like your isolated room, but you're simultaneously like part of a team. There were multiple students who had questions along the lines of like, what was the toughest situation you had to handle as a foreign policy advisor? And if you could go back in time and change anything, what would you change, or like how you like handled that situation? I guess along the lines of like, so much of that is in the moment and like minute to minute and hour to hour that you're developing your advising plan. So you speak to that in any capacity.
Yeah, I think that's a great question for any job that you have in terms of how do you think about the hardest challenge that you had and what would you do differently? And for me, I think the hardest set of challenges we had while I was the Deputy National Security Advisor were around what do we do about the fact that we both consider China a competitor, but also a country that we want to work with. Partially, some of the things that we buy in the United States today come from China. But in addition to that, we know that in some ways, Chinese actors have taken steps that we consider unfair within the global economy. And I think that for us was a tough challenge we spent a lot of time dealing with when I was Deputy National Security Advisor, particularly because I was the president's representative to this thing called the G20. The G20 is a group of the 20 biggest economies in the world, and they meet every year. And each leader, from President Obama to the President of China to the Chancellor of Germany, has a representative to this body. And we meet on a regular basis to prepare the meeting for our leaders. One of the years when I was at the White House, the meeting was held in China and the Chinese were the host. So it gave us an opportunity to think through both what should the agenda be for that meeting, but how do we use it as an opportunity to try and get China to change its behavior in some of these areas. I think in looking back now, something that I would have done earlier and done differently was make sure that I spent more time early on with some of my international counterparts to try and make sure we were all on the same page in terms of what we wanted China to do differently. If you go around the table of any country in the world that's a big economy, they all have concerns with regard to what China's been doing, but their concerns are slightly different. And I think that one of the things you learn early on in a job when you work at the White House is that oftentimes other countries look to America in terms of where should we be going? What should our position be on these issues? And some countries will agree with you and other countries will disagree with you, but everybody wants to know what the United States thinks. So that gives you a certain advantage in terms of any decision making that's international. If I had started that year over, I think that I would have invested more time in something that I spent a lot of time on, which is spending more time with my counterparts. The thing I learned about foreign policy jobs is that you can never spend too much time talking to other countries about what they value and what they care about, because that'll help you in terms of making decisions and convincing them to do things that are both in America's interest, but also in their self-interest as well.
Wow. So I guess like the collaborative, like that relationship building would be like, it was so central to what you're doing, but then simultaneously, like it's the thing you would want to do more of. To what extent does history inform like the decision-making process? Like as history teachers, I was like, I've got to feel like that's like totally part of the conversation that's discussed like with other countries or representatives from other countries, like how the United States has interacted with them in the past, and like to what extent do they feel like they've been perhaps wronged? and how do you you almost have to like rebuild trust from like errors of previous administrations or even things that have 100 plus years before.
So important. And the thing that is important to know as an American official is that oftentimes the country that you're dealing with knows your history as well as you do, and oftentimes has a lens on it that is slightly different. And I know that you've been talking about the Monroe Doctrine in Venezuela, and you look at what's happening in Venezuela today. And the United States has made very clear that the situation in Venezuela right now to us is one in which there's a leader who does not represent the democratic will of that country. When you're the president of the United States, you really have three sets of tools in your tool belt. One is the military, which is like a pretty blunt tool. The second one is diplomacy, which is talking to the other side and trying to better understand their views and to convince them. And the third one are economic tools. And the economic tools can be carrots, like, for example, money for food or aid. And then there can be sticks, which are sanctions. And sanctions is a tool that the United States has in particular that is useful because everywhere in the world, they use the American dollar. So if you tell a country that because you've acted in a manner that's inconsistent with international law, we're going to cut you off from the US dollar, it's a big deal. And that's a tool we've used most with Venezuela today. But the reality is that the US is in a tough position when it comes to foreign policy with Venezuela because of our history in Latin America. So anything that we do in Latin America has to be coordinated and led by Latin American countries to ensure that the country that we are trying to influence isn't able to say that this is just the United States returning to policies of old where they intervened in our countries in ways that undermined our government. So in Venezuela, our foreign policy has been limited because, in part, of history. And because of that history, we've had to rely on other countries in Latin America to deliver the hard messages to Venezuela. And any move that we make with regard to Venezuela, we've had to coordinate with other Latin American countries to ensure that everyone understood that it wasn't the United States acting alone.
And that's the Organization of American States, right? That's like the whole of like basically from Argentina to Canada, like the Western Hemisphere as like a discussing and deliberative body to like kind of police itself. Is that like almost like an evolution of that Monroe Doctrine type of structure, but instead the United States almost taking a like, let's bring all the voices into this discussion of the Western Hemisphere because we see that we've maybe done things in the past that weren't as beneficial for some of these countries as one would have hoped. And so now there's more of a collaborative process in trying to like work together on those decisions.
Yeah, and I think that is clearly the strategy that the U.S. has taken, I'd say, over the last 50 years, is that we've realized that the U.S. remains the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful country in the world. But we've also realized that we're more effective when we're leading a coalition of other countries rather than when we're working alone. That's why working with the Organization of American States makes a great deal of sense for us when it comes to Venezuela. That's why working in the G20 and working with those countries to try and align on what we want China to do makes sense for the United States of America. That's why the United States was at the forefront of creating institutions like the United Nations and NATO, because we realized that we wanted to better share the burden of trying to ensure that the world lived by a set of values that we believe deeply in, and that it's harder to do that by ourselves. So presidents in the past and foreign policy officials have relied on those organizations to help us try and move the world towards a place where democratic and human rights values are maintained, and as a way to ensure that burden is being carried by other countries and not just the United States.
Ms. McLoone, you want to pick up from here? I kind of like I railroaded in a couple questions in a row.
No, that's perfect. That's really interesting. And I love that connection to history and that it's still kind of being used to inform the decisions today. Setting aside those types of politics, in the longer term, this is kind of going more to current events. How do you kind of see COVID-19 impacting foreign policy decisions right now?
In a number of ways, I think that COVID-19 is changing the foreign policy landscape. I think the biggest way that I think will come out of this is that people will realize that the reality is that we're more connected than we think. that a virus that started in Wuhan, China, can impact not only China, but the entire world, will leave us in a place where we're going to need to invest more in public health. And I think public health issues will take a more prominent role in our foreign policy. When I was in the Obama administration, we dealt with the Ebola crisis, which was in Western Africa at that point. And a number of people wondered why the President of the United States was willing to send American troops to Western Africa to help eradicate and prevent the spread of the Ebola crisis. And it was largely because the president and his team at that point knew that any epidemic or pandemic that impacts one place can impact every place. I think that coming out of this, my hope is that it'll leave Americans more interested in how we can use our foreign policy to better defend ourselves, for sure, but also to try and build an infrastructure that better defends the world against things like climate change and pandemics and other issues where the reality is that defending the United States of America means defending the world. So my hope is that it gives us the opportunity to look at issues in a broader way that will better secure the American people.
So more of a global mentality versus kind of that only focused towards US.
Yeah, and I know that's hopeful, and like the reality is that you in history will tell you that oftentimes we go in the other direction. People will say that, oh no, because pandemics can come from Wuhan, China, the thing we should do actually is that we should shut our borders and make sure that no one else can come into the United States of America. And we should ensure that like we try and protect ourselves as much as possible by making sure that we don't allow things like viruses to get to the United States of America. But the reality is the thing you learn from things like pandemics and from climate change is that you can't, it's hard, you can't stop nature. Ultimately, the most remote parts of the world are being impacted by COVID-19. And unless we are willing to invest in global resources to prevent pandemics and things like climate change, they are ultimately going to impact the United States of America. And given that we are the most powerful country in the world with the biggest economy and the biggest military, we're going to bear a disproportionate brunt of anything that is global.
In the frame of like, I guess, knowing that there's so many different people who are advising the president, how, like if you're bringing a perspective that's more like economic and like foreign aid oriented to a conversation with President Obama at the time, or like, I guess this would be like for any presidential advising circumstance, but there are other people in the room who bring like a different lens. Like you hinted at almost like a lack of public health investment and like infrastructure that we obviously see in like our own society right now, but it's certainly a global issue as well. So like when someone comes in with an economic perspective versus someone coming in with like a public health perspective versus the military perspective, I mean, the president has to juggle like a multitude of different ideas and kind of go in a direction. Do you have any like moments that you look back and think about like a person who brought forward a proposal or an idea from like a perspective that you're like, I'm really glad we didn't do that, but like we went with this decision? Or like, I just envision this like multitude of people who are bringing information to the president, and as much as you can try to take a bunch of people's ideas, at some point you have to kind of set aside a bunch of them and go with one.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that was, the reality was my job more than anything on the National Security Council as Deputy National Security Advisor was to help figure out which options we should take to the president. So you would start out with, let's say, a list of 20 things, 20 ideas that people have come in terms of economic ideas alone that could be used to, let's say, that address like Russia's interference in Ukraine and Crimea. But my job is to try and figure out which one of those 20 we think are even viable and we should take to the president. Then after we've done the economic process, someone on another side is doing the cybersecurity process. And there's this person called the National Security Advisor who at the time when I was at the White House, her name was Susan Rice. And I'd say that person is really the quarterback or the point guard. And their job is to take the economic ideas, the cybersecurity ideas, the military ideas, bring them all together, distill them into a set of options for the president, and then sit down with the president and walk him through what we think Mr. President, these are the best ideas that the officials who work for you have come up with to address these challenges. The problem with President Obama, of course, was that he would always find a way to come up with a better idea that we haven't thought of, and then we have to go back and work on. And it remains my problem today when I work for him, because I do the same thing. And oftentimes I'll come to him with like, here's option A, B, C, and then he'll be like, have you thought about E? And I'll be like, of course, I haven't thought about E, but now I will go think about E. So part of my job then in the White House and now today is to tee up options for the president. And then oftentimes a good leader will push you on whether these are the right options and will give you a sense as to where they stand on them. And then you'll go back and do more work. But the key to ensuring the president can make a good decision is ensuring that people like me and other people in the National Security Council run a very good process.
So at this point, I mean, you're not in the White House now and you're working for President Obama still within his like foundation. Can you speak to like what the foundation is doing? I mean, I know he's building like a unique presidential museum in Chicago that's supposed to be like an different than any other presidential museum that like really exists in the United States at this point. But what else, like what is the foundation up to and like what's your role within that?
So I'm the president of the Obama Foundation, and my job is to run the day-to-day of the Obama Foundation. And I think the problem that we set out to solve is one that came from the president's time in government. And what he says when someone asks him that question is that in my time in the White House, the thing that I found was that it wasn't that we didn't have the solutions to problems. That wasn't the challenge. The challenge was that our politics got in the way of solving problems. The best example of this is that when you think about world hunger, people don't go hungry in the world because we don't know how to grow food. We figured out how to grow food. People go hungry because we haven't figured out how to distribute the food that we have in a way that will feed the people that exist on Earth. And this has to do with our politics, with our will as a people. And the place the president wants the foundation to focus on is how do we ensure that the next generation of leaders are thinking through these challenges in a way that is inclusive, that is diverse, that brings diversity of viewpoints to the table, because he thinks that's essential to ensuring that we can solve everything from some of our most basic problems to our most complicated problems. So what we're focused on, in addition to building the Obama Presidential Center, is on training the next generation of leaders, not just in the United States, not just in Chicago, but around the world, because it goes back to what I said earlier, that President Obama realizes that good problems and good solutions don't stop at the borders of the United States of America. So the Obama Presidential Center is unique because, unlike other presidential museums that simply tell the story of the presidency and take you back on a journey through time, the goal for the Obama Presidential Center is for people to come to the Presidential Center and to be inspired and to see in themselves leaders. Maybe not presidents of the United States, but people who can go back to their local communities and lead in ways that help contribute to the change that the world needs.
Wow,
that's awesome.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been to like a presidential library, Miss McLoone, but like they are not necessarily the most like forward-looking spaces, really. Like it is just kind of like, you know, here's the Air Force One, and like here's, you know, the suit that this president wore to like this event. It's like you're being in the Smithsonian or like just a big museum in general versus something that's more forward looking, like using like the moments of the Obama presidency to kind of think about like how to move people forward is pretty empowering.
That's amazing. I hope I get to visit it at some point.
Well, I hope you all do. I think it'll be like a great thing to visit. I think for me, the exciting part of it is the idea that like it'll inspire people to action. Rather than like nostalgia, because the thing that we all need more of is people taking steps in their own communities to make the change happen that we want to see in the world. Because the thing that President Obama continues to come back to is that before he was president of the United States, before he was a senator, he was a community organizer here on the south side of Chicago, trying to help this community better itself. And he thinks that getting more people to think about how they can think about ways to better their local communities is the only way that we actually get the kind of change we want in this country and in the world. So I hope that you and your students get a chance to visit the Obama Presidential Center.
Very much so. I have like don't know if we could end on a better note.
Yeah.
I'm out of questions at that point, unless either of you two have something else you want to add in.
I just want to say thank you. I know that foreign policy can feel far away as you're studying this subject that feels like far away from where you live and what you're thinking about on a regular basis. But as somebody who has been a practitioner, I just want us to remember that it matters because the things we do in foreign policy have an impact on the day-to-day lives of the people that we love and care about. I think no greater issue than COVID-19 points this out. So I appreciate your teachers for taking the time to sit down with me. I appreciate each one of you thinking about how foreign policy matters to your life. So thank you guys for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been awesome.